Welcome to episode 5 of Pedder Unplugged. I'm Tabitha Badger. Today's episode is with Dr. Geoff Holloway. Geoff's an Australian sociologist, an author, and an environmental political activist with the United Tasmania Group. The UTG is accredited as being the world's first green values political party. It was formed at the Hobart Town Hall on March 23, 1972, sparked by the community outrage over the environmental and social injustice that was the flooding of Lake Pedder. Our conversation starts with the formation of the UTG, and along the way we discuss ecocentrism, tourism, and the value of nature. About halfway through the episode, we get stuck right into Lake Pedder. Geoff concisely and meticulously covers an exceptionally important global conservation political movement that started right here in Tasmania. So grab a cuppa and maybe a notepad for this episode too. Episode 5 of Pedder Unplugged with Dr. Geoff Holloway.
We'll start with 1972. The Save Lake Pedder National Park Committee was the first organisation to push for saving the park. That was under Peter Sims. And then there was the Lake Pedder Action Committee, LPAC. Having an organisation in the northwest, based in the northwest coast, and then one in the south, is probably symptomatic at the time of the division of politics and conservation politics at that time between the north and the south. I think that's largely resolved itself today, I hope. The other thing is that it was interesting about LPAC, and really Kevin Kiernan should be talking about this rather than myself, was how strong the support was from other parts of Australia, particularly Victoria. And I suspect that's still pretty strong as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, the why, how, etc., the formation of UTG, well, as you know, there was the public meeting in the town hall on the 23rd of March 1972, which is in effect the official launch date of UTG. I will comment a bit about the subsequent state elections. I mean, once UTG was formed in 1972, we only had 4 weeks to campaign before the state elections. But during that very short period of time, UTG managed to produce a broadsheet called the UTG Extra. I've forgotten how many pages the first issue was now. And as far as I can determine, there were 20,000 copies of this printed and letterboxed across the state. And the interesting thing about the UTG Extra, all the UTG Extras are reproduced in the UTG story, that's journal issue number 6. One of the interesting things about the UTG Extra and the subsequent extras that were produced was the focus on a whole range of issues facing Tasmania. Environmental, economic, political, social, because Lake Pedder really was symbolic of all of these types of issues. You know, the steamrolling of hydro-industrialisation, the criminal breach of what was the Lake Pedder National Park by allowing the hydro to go in. Now, that was subsequently led to, the resignation of the Attorney-General when it was brought up that it was illegal what they were doing. And then, of course, there was legislation to make it legal that subsequently followed. So that's fairly symptomatic in a nutshell of the Tasmanian way.
Yes.
Okay. And that hasn't changed a lot. In fact, Kevin Kiernan's book on eroding the edges of nature,
Yep.
Enormous wealth of information as to what was happening back then, and it wasn't just about Mayfield National Park, it was much more general than that. And those lessons from then still haven't been learnt. When I say haven't been learnt by the political establishment or the general public, for that matter, in Tasmania. So we're still facing the same old issues. The other thing about that first election and subsequent elections, because as you know, UTG contested 10 elections from 1972 to 1978 was the last one. It was basically an election, 1977 was the last one, Chris Rathbone. It was basically contesting an election every 6 months. So that's a lot of campaigning. And one of the interesting issues about that is that back in those days, even though, as far as I can calculate and checking on financial records, at the beginning of 1974, we only had 200 members. That is 200 financial members. There may have been more. I mean, that subsequently grew to 335, and I think that's fairly comprehensive. But what was interesting back then was that everyone was an activist in their own right, like according to their own abilities, according to their other responsibilities, etc., which is quite different from today. It's quite different from today. Today, participation tends to be much more cursory, or it's symbolic, or it's vicarious participation might be the right terminology. And what that means is that, and it's also become highly professionalised, so you have to pay for all your printing, a high-class printing, blah, 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 etc. I mean, back in the mid-70s, UTG we had our own industrial-sized printing press, and someone who could operate it. That was Brenton Weir. And one of the things we very much focused on, largely due to Chris Cowles, who was our graphic designer back then and still is today, was a focus on high design quality. And that wasn't just with respect to our publications, but also in terms of our part of our economic policies was to promote design-based industries in Tasmania. I think that's one of the fundamental issues or aspects of UTG. The other interesting thing doing the compilation, and one of the reasons I did the compilation of all our policies, which took about 7 months or 8 months altogether, including the design process, was the heavy emphasis on economic policies, which I didn't anticipate. I mean, I've seen all this stuff before, but I hadn't thought of it that way. But there was a lot of emphasis and detail on economic policies. The other thing was that during the elections, one of the things we focused on wasn't so much Lake Pedder, particularly in the early years, but on the Hare-Clark system, the preferential voting system, because the general public didn't understand it. So we had to play an educational role with respect to that. The other thing, and this was largely driven by Dr. Richard Dick Jones, who was the president of UTG, and who I regard as my political father, was his enormous ability in strategic thinking. In fact, I used to say that Dick was 2 blocks down the street and around the next corner from where I was thinking. He was so far more advanced than me. So hopefully I've learnt a bit since then. In the Bass by-election, when Dr. Kathleen Petrosky stood, I was up in Launceston as campaign manager. I was state secretary at that time as well. And Dick announced that we were going to negotiate preferences with the major parties. And I thought, what? We're going to negotiate preferences? Well, he had no intention of negotiating preferences. What he was interested in was trying to see what the two major parties would offer. And they did offer things like, for example, out of the Liberals, we got $3,000 to set up the Launceston Environment Centre, which existed up until a couple of years ago. We also got promises on Southwest Tasmania and World Heritage status, again from the Libs. It was quite different the way the preference negotiations went. When Dick announced that we were open to negotiation on preferences, the Labor Party sent around their union thugs and promised to bash our lights out if we gave our preferences to the Libs. Whereas the Libs, on the other hand, invited us round for afternoon tea and scones, which we did. So I'll never forget that. But anyway, that's just by the by. There's a whole lot of anecdotes I could go on for ages about. One of the big differences between UTG and the other parties is a new ethic, which has sometimes been described, I've seen it described as an ecocentric manifesto. In actual fact, it's ecocentric, definitely, but it's a statement of ethical principles rather than a manifesto. And the other parties don't have that. The other thing that we really set out to do, and we've failed to actually achieve it, was to change political culture for people to realise there was a third force out there, and that this dichotomisation or polarisation between the left and the right was no longer relevant. As Dick said, our credo was neither left nor right, but out in front. Well, we haven't quite managed to achieve that third force sort of persona, but that was the original idea, to get people to think beyond the two-party system.
It's so incredible how forward-thinking all of this principles and statements and everything was from the UTG, and I can only imagine how frustrating it is seeing the exact same fights going on socially and with the environment today.
Yeah, well, and of course, we were the world's first green party, although the term green wasn't used back then. So we were completely novel. As Associate Professor Kate Crowley says, UTG invented a new type of politics. We didn't know we were inventing a new type of politics. we just wanted to get some changes. We wanted to restore Lake Pedder as well. But we'd do it, but we'd not just Lake Pedder, but, change the whole system and direction. I was also surprised in the compilation when I put it together how detailed a lot of our policies were. I thought, and these policies were put together in pretty quick time. And mind you, they were developed. We had 15 policy committees and we had 17 branches across Tasmania.
I've actually got one of the policies, the UTG tourism policy, and it starts out with the UTG has long recognised that tourism offers one of the greatest challenges for Tasmania for appropriate development. It's not enough for the Liberal Party to offer management skills of its politicians. It won't make much difference. And it's just completely true to today as well.
Yes, well, as we always argued, even right back from 1972 onwards, that any developments in national parks need to be on the edge, outside the national parks, not in the national parks. We also argued from an ecocentric perspective, that is, nature comes first, and that seems to have been dropped. The opposite of ecocentrism is anthropocentrism, which is putting humanity first. I'll qualify what I've said about ecocentrism being dropped because I produced an article just 2 years ago now, which is still being downloaded at between 50 and 100 times a week. And I don't know where this is coming from, this interest, but it's just exploded. So I think out there in the general world, there's a renewed interest in the idea of thinking differently about nature, and ecocentrism is one of the shifts I think we need to take. We have to stop thinking that we can fix things with the technological fix. We have to think about nature first and not think about humanity having dominion over the earth, as it were. Until we make that shift, I'm not very optimistic about the future. But there is a shift out there. There's obviously a shift out there because this thing keeps being downloaded.
When was the first time that you went to Lake Pedder?
Oh, the first time. Oh, that's a hard one.
Was it by plane or foot?
I gave you a copy of that wet trip when we crossed the Serpentine River twice and to climb Coronation Peak. That was with Chris Rathbone. Well, that was published in 1971 in the Hobart Walking Club magazine, the Tasmanian Tram. And it was January 1971 from memory. So it would have been the year before. Now, that certainly wasn't my first trip into that area. The one amazing event I remember was that there was a long weekend and there was a mass migration to Pedder, and there was reportedly 1,000 people in at Lake Pedder. I think that's the biggest number of people that's ever been subjected to and survived. It was basically a celebration of Lake Pedder before it went under.
Yeah, it's interesting looking at and listening to people talk about the degradation of the wilderness character of Lake Pedder from mass visitation once the announcement was made that it would be flooded, and then that realisation started to set in that the place would be lost or modified, as they put it. And that's sort of the first time that anything in the southwest was subjected to what we would call today over-tourism. Today we sold tourism products as a once-in-a-lifetime sort of experience. You have to see Cradle Mountain before you die. But it's going to be there forever. We hope that it would be there forever. And it's kind of leading to this urgency to see all of these places and tick them off your bucket list of things before you're going to die.
Yeah, well, speaking of Cradle Mountain, I used to love Cradle Mountain. I've climbed it at least 10 times, including a traverse in winter. But now I'll never go back there now because it's just too touristified, especially if they put that cable car in. there's no way I'm going to go there. And I know other people feel the same.
Yeah, absolutely. I was doing a bit of a protest by not visiting Cradle Mountain, and I happened to be in the area in April when the Fagus out. I drove in as far as I could to Ronnie Creek and then walked in before the sun came up. I think I was walking at 4 a.m. or something, and got up to Hanson's Peak for sunrise, and it was just beautiful. There was nothing but the sound of currawongs and the Fagus igniting the whole valley. And then as I was walking out, all the people started coming in on the shuttle buses. And for a moment, I remembered how special it actually was. And then very soon got the polarization of how much it has changed and that Disneyfication of the location. Did you ever experience that at Pedder from over time when there was more and more people, that it lost a bit of its special character?
Well, there was only that one particular weekend when there were 1,000 people in there, but normally you wouldn't see more than half a dozen people. And as I've said, it's not just Pedder, but the whole of the Serpentine Valley. It's pretty fascinating. And then just to walk along the Franklin Range is pretty incredible as well. And the good thing is if you come in from the Gordon River Road and then just before you come to Pedder, you go up this small hill and come to the top, and there it is right in front of you. And it's that particular moment is quite special when you see it for the first time walking in from the Gordon River Road.
That's interesting that you mentioned the Serpentine as well. It's so often forgotten in terms of Lake Pedder. We often focus on the really defining geographical features of the beach and the dunes and that herringbone pattern where the lake's lapping the shore there. But the Serpentine River and the moorlands down there are quite extraordinary as well.
Yes, and very wet.
Yeah.
You can't do that sort of trip anymore. We also, a group of us, I think there are 4 of us, took in a dinghy with a small outboard and went down parts of the Serpentine. I'm not sure what year that is, but I can check because I can go back to the slides, which back in those days had the date stamped on them. I've only got one photo of that, not crash shot as a description or as a photo of the Serpentine, but it's the whole of the valley that's important.
Yeah, the biodiversity within the Serpentine Valley is extraordinarily unique, and Dr. Anita Wild's, ecological scoping study really highlighted those credentials that restoration would have into the whole valley, not just a partial restoration that would uncover Pedder in terms of perhaps being an icon or more of just a tourism destination rather than being able to reap those entire environmental rewards and benefit from that.
Yes, I think with respect to restoration of Lake Pedder, etc., then we need to seriously limit the numbers of people. Otherwise, they're going to lose what's precious about them altogether. I mean, the approach is all about managing people. It's not about managing or looking after ecosystems. It's the reverse order in priorities. So that's ecocentrism versus anthropocentrism in a nutshell.
Socially, the flooding of Lake Pedder, there was kind of 2 components to the outrage, the environmental destruction and the corruption within politics that allowed it to happen. And as a consequence, we had the formation of the UTG, which has socially continued to ensure that there is a party or created the foundations for other parties such as the Green.
Oh, I'm busy. Joe.
You're in great demand today. I mean, I assume you are most days, but
no, I'm not most days.
It's the curse of the Zoom call.
Yeah.
The flooding of Pedder, do you feel like that's changed or influenced society in other ways? It's helped create the necessary campaign tools that helped save the Franklin, but has it continued to shape anything in modern society in your perspective, or has it sort of, pardon the pun, just sat under the water and almost being forgotten in some respects?
Society in general, but I do know that the loss of Lake Pedder severely damaged a lot of people and really made it emotionally difficult for them, and still does today. That's 50 years later. It wasn't just a loss of a national park. It was much more than that. And you can see from the various artists that have painted Lake Pedder how they tried to capture what was special about the place. So I guess that's in a nutshell. I don't know whether it's changed the general public's perception. I guess there's a shift. There's definitely been a shift away from the dominant economic theme at the time, which was Tasmania was dependent on hydro-industrialisation. However, having said that, that could come back again, because with this second Bass link proposed, the idea is Tasmania becomes, a hydro or alternative energy generator for Australia, and that will generate, and that it'll lead to hydrogen plants, blah, 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 etc. I'll say, well, wait a minute, where's all this electricity coming from? Where do you intend to put new dams, etc.? I mean, I think it's crazy. I think the Bass link and the proposed Marinus link should be abandoned, and Tasmania should become independent from the national grid, because we could certainly do it. In fact, and it's not just Tasmania, it's across the world. I mean, as you're probably aware, there's hundreds of dams being built across the world in order to generate so-called renewable energy, which is not renewable when you look at the environmental costs. Mind you, conversely, there are a lot of dams being pulled down, particularly in the US, for example. But there's an awful lot of dams being proposed for parts of Europe, like the Balkans, etc. It's scary. So the world's going in two different directions.
Yeah, and there is the cost implications, particularly around specifically here, Marinus and Battery in the Nation, that is an awful lot of money to invest in what could quite possibly become a stranded asset exceptionally quickly, with the rate that technology and other forms of battery storage coming onto the grid, solar, the hydrogen that's happening on the mainland.
Yes, I agree.
So many unanswered questions and considerations. And it's interesting, one of the arguments for Marinus and Battery of the Nation often comes that, well, Tasmania has the resources to create hydro and wind power, therefore we have an obligation to help the mainland to relinquish their coal and gas fire reliance. But if it comes at the compromise of our biodiversity and our functioning ecosystems, while the mainland is still approving coal and gas exploration and new mines and still investing in those power sources, why should Tasmania help when they're not helping themselves in some regards?
Exactly. That's a bit of a reversal of the normal process, as Tasmania being regarded as the burden on the nation. Now suddenly the nation wants Tasmania to support it. But they don't think about Tasmania in a different sense of being at least one of the last preserves of temperate wilderness in the world, not for exploitation purposes, but for preservation purposes. That's where the focus should be.
Just circling back, when you were talking about the impact of seeing Pedder over the hill, what did that do for you personally?
I used to have a large Lake Pedder poster which I had up on the wall, but I took it down after a few months because it wasn't so much depressing, but it wasn't something I wanted to be reminded about every day. Because if I'm naturally an optimistic person, but if I want to be optimistic, this made me feel uncomfortable in a way. Maybe perhaps I should have done more, sort of thing, like, oh, what did I do wrong? What could I have done better? Things like that. I don't blame systems. I don't blame economic systems. I don't blame political systems. I focus on what I could have done or what I've learnt or what I can do better. So that, because if I give systems the power to explain why we're in a mess, then that completely disempowers me as an individual to do something about it. I might as well go, go home. Well, I am home, but I may as well give up. I may as well give up. If you're with me, that's a bit of a convoluted way of explaining something.
No, it's completely accurate that the power is with the individual, and it's each of us that can make such a big difference. And although Pedder wasn't saved, the UTG formed and the Greens Party have come out of that, and so many other wild places have been saved consequently. And I mean, by whatever miracle that none of us will ever be able to explain, system or otherwise, there's so many components of Pedder that have been preserved and are just sitting there waiting to be restored. The fact that after all the bushfires that have been through the southwest, there's still only a thin millimetres of sediment sitting on the beach and the dune system that could be washed away in a few rainfall events. That the dunes and the beach and the main lake basin of Pedder, Lake Maria and the Serpentine sort of part of the river remains intact. That the Galaxis there's the translocated population that still remain as well. It's sort of surreal that all of these things are still in existence.
Yeah. One of my greatest fears is that people of my generation are being very irresponsible by dying. I fear that once there's no one left who has actually been to Pedder, then a lot of the impetus will go to restore it. That's one of my fears.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And it's something I'm very conscious of, and a factor in why we actually started this podcast, because those stories of everyone that has been to Pedder or was associated or their life was affected by Pedder. And it seems like every other person in Tasmania has a story of Pedder or knows of some myth about it or mysterious influence that it's had directly or indirectly on their life. And keeping those stories alive is really essential in inspiring the younger generation. If you talk to the younger campaigners who aren't old enough to have visited the original Lake Pedder like myself, and why they're involved, because we don't have an emotional connection to that original place. We're never there. So it's not a nostalgic trip for us, but everyone has been motivated by the stories of people like yourself who visited the original lake, who can, we still remain outraged by the corruption and the loss and how it's unfathomable that it ever happened to begin with. I think we're in such a unique time at the moment that there is a crossover of the two generations, this younger generation that are going to inherit the climate and biodiversity crisis and are becoming activists and empowering themselves to try and save all of the wild places that they can, and the Pedder people who have been the stronghold of the campaign for just going on to 50 years, that now is a really important time to share those stories and come together with the intergenerations to push the restoration cause, particularly in the climate crisis, not because restoring Lake Pedder on its own is going to solve that crisis, but because of the ripple effect and the influence that the action of restoring Pedder will have on the rest of the world.
Yeah, I like that. I'm writing an article on Prince Philip's visit to Tasmania in 1973. Now, he took an RAAF flight down to the southwest and the Franklin River, the Gordon River, and also Lake Pedder, and then flew back to Melbourne. And then the following day, he flew to Tasmania for his official visit. And I've got photos of the people protesting with Lake Pedder signs, etc. In fact, a lot of the people who are protesting are still part of UTG today. And then the convoy went to Government House, and Prince Philip had a private meeting with Eric Rees, the Premier, Electric Eric, as he was called, had a private meeting, and the doors were shut, but people could hear from the outside that there was a shouting match between Prince Philip and the Premier, Eric Rees. So that's a way of saying, look, this, this is a bit of history that people need to know about, basically.
Sent me through the 9 lessons of Lake Pedder, and the start of the document says, from the loss of Lake Pedder, some of the lessons learnt were as follows. And number 9, that despite the devastation of Lake Pedder, most of all keep a strong sense of humour.
Yeah, that doesn't just come out of Lake Pedder, it comes out of many organisations I've worked with. It's really important, particularly in high pressure or high stress times. That's the most important characteristic to have.
That was episode 5 of Pedder Unplugged, and it's our last episode for 2021. Next year is going to be huge for Lake Pedder. 2022 is the 50th year since Pedder was flooded, the 50th year since the United Tasmania Group formed, the 50th year since we tragically lost Brenda Heen and Max Price. If you want to keep up to date with everything that's happening Lake Pedder-wise next year, head to lakepedder.org/get involved and sign up to our mailing list. Have a great Christmas and New Year.